Hey, it's Brian. Quick note about this week's episode. The sixth book is Heaven is a Playground by Rick T. Lander. Promise this is going to make sense in about 34 minutes or so. All right, enjoy the show. This is The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week I'm talking with Leander Schaerlaeckens, a lecturer at Marist College and columnist for Yahoo Sports. First of all, congratulations. We were just talking before we recorded. Congratulations on finishing the semester and on getting through what had to have been a crazy semester for all of us teaching.
It was a long, weird, strange semester, and I hope we don't have another one like it.
Right. So how many classes do you teach at Marist?
3 in the fall, 4 in the spring. I teach sports reporting every semester pretty much. I teach a sport culture and communication class, an issues in sports media class, a class I created called Center Field, which is kind of a practicum where our students cover Marist athletics, which is Division I, as a class. So basically they go out and report a story surrounding one of the varsity teams every week. And they sort of produce that and put that up on the website. And in the fall, I've got a new class that we've created called Sport and Social Media, which should be interesting.
Oh, that would be cool. Yeah. So from teaching, especially teaching sports writing, because I found my own challenges on this, but I'd love talking to you about it. What was it like teaching sports media and sports reporting courses when there's no sports going on, especially that practicum course where they have to produce content and they're used to covering games or doing stuff like that. But now all of a sudden that content, that threw me for a loop for a few weeks. I don't know about you, but that was a real challenge.
Yeah, that class in particular was a difficult one to sort of figure out how that was going to work online. But I think they caught on pretty quick that just because sports wasn't being played, that there was no sports. I mean, it just consisted of stories about there not being anything happening on the field. But at the same time, it's been one of the more sort of newsy times that I can remember in sports, because you've got all these leagues trying to figure out what they're going to look like, what they're going to be. You've got a league in the XFL folding. You've got all these different negotiations happening between sort of, owners trying to go back on collective bargaining agreements and trying to work out what that's going to look like. You've still got drafts that are done remotely. So there was a huge amount of news, even if there was nothing actually happening on the field. So the trick was trying to get students to understand that. And for a class like Center Field, where they're supposed to cover not necessarily games, but kind of game-related stories, ideally, to kind of get them to switch their mindset and say, okay, well, now what we're going to cover is there not being any games and what the ramifications of that are, and how that sort of changes the lives of these athletes and coaches. So they came up with some cool stories, like how do you recruit your next class of football players when you can't go see them and you can't really have a physical interaction of any kind? Or how do you coach a team? How do you keep team chemistry sort of healthy? How do you take care of your players when you can't see them? So that was an adjustment, I think, for all of us, but they figured it out.
So was that a tough adjustment for them, do you think?
I think there was just kind of an assumption that, okay, there's no sports, so I guess this class is, maybe we'll do some readings and whatever. But so I think they caught on pretty quickly that, when a cataclysm like this happens, it sort of reverberates through everything. And because sports is everything, and because sports is intertwined with every single part of our society, that it's actually kind of a perfect little microcosm to tell the story of this pandemic through.
It's been interesting, yeah, because you mentioned how there's no sports, but there's been no shortage of sports content, which is kind of interesting. I think a lot of us in sports media kind of had this weird little existential panic in March of what are we going to do? And there's been plenty to do, and there's been plenty to talk about and write about I think one thing that's impressive for me is without kind of exhausting those typical feature stories that you would see, like how athletes are spending their time. And, on this, there's been a lot of, I think, interesting creativity around sports media, and kind of reflected in some of the stuff our students did too.
It sort of forced you to be creative. I mean, it's funny because I have two jobs. I teach at Marist, and I'm a soccer columnist at Yahoo Sports, and somehow I was busier than ever between getting classes online and getting that going, and which is a lot more work than walking into a room and talking for an hour and engaging and grading and having some meetings. But so between that and the other job, where all of a sudden we had to figure out very new ways of telling stories because there's no games to cover, and you kind of have to put more work into finding the news and finding something to talk about. We were busier than ever in a way, but I think having a wrench thrown at them like this for students is a really valuable experience. Partly because I think it's entirely possible that we now just live in an age of pandemics, and that a first brush with that and how to handle that during college is actually really useful and educational. But also, so much of journalism and so much of learning what journalism is understanding that things change all the time, and the conditions in which you do your job change all the time. It's a very volatile industry, as I don't think I have to explain to anybody. And so to have that kind of formative experience early on while you're still learning what the trade is useful.
Mm-hmm. That teaching of flexibility, I think, and creativity is super valuable. I think, it's not just, you can't rely on things being normal. You can't rely on games, and that ability to I hate the word pivot because it's overused in media circles, but that ability to be agile and be able to work around and, figure out a solution to this. There's no sports. What do you do? And be able to get over that hump and create stuff. So had you ever taught online before all this?
I had not. That
Okay.
was a whole new experience.
What was that like for you?
It was really different. So this semester I was teaching an honor seminar on American sports literature, where basically it was just me and 18 students, and we read these 6 sort of classic sports books. And then we talk about them in class. It was pretty straightforward. We moved that onto Discord, which is a gaming community platform, I would say, and we just turned it into basically a big group chat, and that worked really well. Other classes aren't so easy. I had a lecture class, sport culture communication, and I'm used to just kind of standing in front of the class, and I'll talk about something for half an hour, and I'll show lots of videos and pictures, and then we'll have a discussion or a group activity or something. And that was much harder to translate that online. So I kind of been tinkering with the format, and I wound up just kind of writing out my lectures and then having them do forum posts and everything. And I'm not sure that worked as well as it possibly could have. I'd revisit that, but we were discouraged from having synchronous learning because not everyone has, not all internet connections are created equal. Not everybody's in the same time zone. Not everybody's in the same kind of environment. Not everybody's able to do that. So we were trying to be as inclusive as possible, by avoiding making students sit in front of their computers at a certain time. So we weren't supposed to do that. So that one was a lot trickier. Classes like the sports reporting class and the center field class, we eventually kind of figured out where most of that class was me kind of, for sports reporting, explaining how to write a column, what a rough structure is for a column, what makes something a column, et cetera. You can do that fairly well remotely, and then assign something. And then with the center field class, mostly what our classes boiled down to when we met in person was having an editorial meeting and coming up with stories. So we could do that from afar too. So it was really a mixed bag. I think some classes worked better than others, but it was educational, that's for sure.
That's interesting that you use Discord. I had one of my students at my school suggest using that as a platform, and I haven't, but it seems like it's a really potentially powerful platform to use for kind of like not just teaching, but like teaching, thinking of it as like an online community almost, rather than like the I don't know, we use Blackboard. I don't know what your learning system is, but they're all very kind of like awful and hierarchical and very grade centric. And so I feel like Discord and stuff like that is much more suited to a discussion based situation or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to meet your students where they are. And a lot of them were already on Discord because I could see sort of when I'd log in to kind of read their posts and read their contributions to the discussion. Said so-and-so is playing whatever, League of Legends, and so is playing this thing. So you could see that they're already on there, and they sort of had it linked to whatever games they play. I'm not a big gamer, so I'm probably getting those wrong. But it made it really fluid, and I think it made it feel a little bit less like school and more like a community. I mean, it helped that it was a class that they were really into, and that they sort of had to, not battle exactly, but it wasn't the easiest class to get into. So they were keen on that class, which is a good head start to have. But I really liked how loose the format became, and you could use emojis, and you could kind of give someone a it wasn't called a poke, but something like that, where you could give someone a nudge and things like that. So it made it really informal, which is kind of how I like to teach anyway, because it was just a lot easier to retain their attention when instead of having a format where we would have a discussion, over that hour and 15-minute class period, 2 times a week. Instead of that, I made 48-hour windows. So I'd say, okay, so instead of the Tuesday class, we have all of Monday and Tuesday for you to post. Instead of the Thursday class, you have all of Wednesday and Thursday. And so whenever it was sort of convenient to them, whenever they'd finished their reading, they could sort of go over what everybody else had said, chime in, and kind of that got a really good dialogue going. So it sort of felt like the less structure there was to it in that sense, the lower the barriers to entry, the better they did with it. So that was really revelatory to me.
That's interesting. You mentioned how, along with teaching, you also write a column for Yahoo Sports, and I'm wondering how much is your teaching, especially in the sports writing courses, how much is that is informed by the fact that you're still doing this, that you're still a columnist, and maybe vice versa? Is your columnist or your columns affected by your teaching at all?
Oh, I think it's everything. I mean, I consider them, they are separate jobs, but in so many ways they're intertwined. I mean, just in the practical sense, being in the industry still, as I've been for 10 years, I came up with ESPN.com. Then I was there for 2.5 years, a little bit longer. And then I was with Fox Sports for 2.5 years. And I've been at Yahoo for 5.5 years almost now. And so, that's where I came from. I'm very much an accidental academic, which is a whole other discussion. But being in the industry, knowing how it works, knowing what things are like right now, and being able to impart that, and my classes are very much about trying to make my students plug and play when they graduate, where nobody in the business has time to train anybody. Nobody really has time to teach you anything. When you come out of school, you need to be ready to go. Whatever level it is that you hook on, you need to be ready to do a job, because otherwise I don't know that there is going to be a job for you. So I try as much as possible to get my students ready for the jobs that they're after. And so doing that job yourself is hugely helpful, because I think that makes what I'm teaching them current. At the same time, I think when they sign up for my class, they're also signing up for my connections and my network within the industry. And I try where I can to get them, whether it's a source for a story, or it's an internship that they're trying to go after, or it's someone they admire and they'd like to have a connection to. I think being in the business really helps me with being a bit of a bridge for my students to get there as well. I'm lucky we also have a Center for Sports Communication on campus that's run by the great Jane McManus, recently of ESPN, and still a columnist for the New York Daily News, and she very much does the same thing. And so in that sense, the columnist job and the teaching job are aligned, but it works the other way as well. I find myself, I've become better at my writing job, or I'd like to think anyway. Some commenters might disagree. But since I've started teaching, because it's really forced me to think very deeply about what makes a story work, what makes a column compelling, what makes a gamer more than just, a game happened between team X and team Y, which is such an outdated format. How do you get it to really pop? How do you make it a story that adds to what somebody saw when he watched the game, or when she had the highlights on her phone and the box score and whatever? So just kind of breaking down structures of columns that work well for students has also kind of made me reassess how I write them in the Yahoo part of my life.
Yeah, I found that too. Like when I write now, I can hear what I've said to students in my own head and being like, "Oh, that's or that's like, don't structure it well, or think through the structure, or
Yeah.
you kind of hear yourself teaching your students as you're writing yourself. So I'd love to get into that accidental academic path. So what was your career path? How did you get to where you are right now?
So the only thing I'd ever wanted to be was a sports writer. I decided when I was 14, 15, I probably wasn't good enough to be an athlete. So, which it was extremely true, as it turns out. So, all right, what's the next best thing? Well, I like to write. Okay, sports writer, done. Let's go do that. Then I was lucky that I actually became that. I'm from the Netherlands. I grew up in Belgium. I went to college in London and at City University, which is part of University of London now, studied journalism. And while I was there, I did all 3 of my internships, I believe, at The Guardian, which is the only place I applied to because I was an arrogant little brat. And I was like, it's The Guardian or bust, even though I was obligated for my course to do internships. So if I hadn't gotten them, I don't know what I would have done, but whatever. So I was on the sports desk at The Guardian as an intern, and that went well. And then I went to grad school at American University, and coming out of that, I somehow hooked on with UPI, which was still somewhat of a thing, as a wire service, and the Washington Times, believe it or not, as their Brussels correspondents, moved back to Brussels, or I was a stringer really, it was kind of glorified correspondent, and covered NATO and the EU, and then we moved back stateside, and I couldn't get hired for the worst jobs in the industry. And then ESPN decided that, 6 months before this, the 2010 World Cup, which he wasn't quite the president yet, I think, but John Skipper, who would run ESPN for a long time, had made this huge bet on. And so they decided that for the first time in company history, they were going to hire full-time soccer writers. And I was actually the first one hired. So, I could not get some of the worst jobs. I won't identify them exactly, but I couldn't get any of these terrible jobs. And then suddenly ESPN hired me. Like, all right, as its first soccer writer for ESPN.com. And so, like I said, I did that for a while. Then after the 2014 World Cup, which I'd covered for Fox, I went to South Africa for ESPN. So I went to Brazil for Fox. And after that, a buddy of mine, who I played pickup soccer with, he taught at Marist. And he asked if I wanted to come talk to his class about mega events. Yeah, sure, I'll come talk. And then after that, I really liked that. I enjoyed that. After that, I got asked if I wanted to adjunct a class, sports reporting. I said, yeah, sure, I'll give it a try. I had a good friend who'd sort of transitioned from sports writing to being an academic, and it seemed like he really liked it, and he kind of had it figured out, and it was a better work-life balance for him. And so I adjuncted a class, and then another class, and then another class. And then I kind of took a break from it for a while because we were having a baby. My wife did all the work, but anyway, I'll take credit for it. And then Yahoo was about to be bought by Verizon and to become Oath and then Verizon Media. And there was kind of all this insecurity and all this uncertainty. And this job opened up at Marist, a sports communication lecturer job, which seemed right for me. So that's how I got it. So, a college that happens to be 25 minutes up the road, which is so unusual in academia, that you get to actually take a job that's right by you and you don't have to move. There's no PhD required or anything like that. And it just kind of was a good fit. And I really like teaching, and I wouldn't want to do anything else anymore. And it's put me in a really fortunate position where I can kind of pick and choose what writing I like to do. I mean, I have a sort of, I don't want to say full-time because it's not full-time, but I have a steady gig with Yahoo Sports. But I can kind of pick and choose what I want to do rather than it being, my whole income and sort of my central way of earning a living. So it's a really nice mix. I highly recommend academia plus sort of a thing on the side in whatever your field is, because it kind of takes the pressure off and it makes it a lot easier to enjoy that job, I think.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the piece you wrote for Slate. I think it was 2 weeks ago now. Let me want to get the headline right because it's great. Was Donald Trump good at baseball? Spoiler alert, no. So it's a great piece. It's really inventive. The link is in show notes for this. Where did the idea for you writing this piece come from?
So it's funny. So we live in the Hudson Valley now. My wife is from here. She's from Newburgh, and her uncle had been a baseball star at a tiny private school called the Storm King School, um, which is about 10 minutes from the New York Military Academy. And my father-in-law had always had this idea that he was going to go down to the local library, go through the microfilm, and find all the local newspaper stories about his brother, who'd been, again, this sort of big baseball star there. And one day he sort of mentions, Trump played there around the same time. I was like, yeah, I knew that. He said, I bet you could find his stories too in the local papers. And then it took me an embarrassingly long time to actually follow up on that and to go and take a look, because it turned out to be a really good tip. But so in doing a little bit of research, I found all these old quotes from Trump, and some of them not so old, claiming that he was the best ball player in New York, and that he was a pro prospect, and that he was a great athlete, and all the rest. So like, all right, let's go fact check. So it took a little while, but eventually going through this microfilm, I found probably a half dozen old game stories in the microfilm, and then on newspapers.com, which is this subscription service that's got these archives of all these old papers, I found another 5 or 6, and putting them together, I held all these box scores, and it turned out that between 9 games, which doesn't sound like a lot, but NEMA, the New York Military Academy, only played 10 games a season, so Trump's high school career was only about 30 games, that he'd hit 138. And that he wasn't nearly the best player on his own team, let alone in the States. And sort of the whole thing started to unravel from there, finding out, had he really been scouted? Extremely unlikely. Was he a pro prospect? Absolutely not. It's also notable, by the way, that he's the only president since Teddy Roosevelt who's not thrown out a first pitch while in office at a Major League Baseball game, which is weird because he has done it before at a Yankee game. And at a Pawtucket Sox game once, I believe, when he landed his helicopter in center field, which is very Trumpian. But so this whole thing started to come apart, and it was all just sitting there in the microfilm in this local library. And then I tracked down a bunch of former teammates, and like any 70-something guy reminiscing about his high school baseball career, they all remembered themselves a little bit better than they were. But none of them were like, oh yeah, he was a baseball prodigy. He was definitely going to make it. They all said, yeah, he was pretty good. He was a good fielding first baseman. Trump's preferred position was catcher. So he didn't even get to play the position he actually liked the best, because there was always a better catcher on the team. So he played first base. And he hit 6th. At this tiny school at the time, NEMA was kind of as big as it would ever be. It's down to less than 100 students now, but between 6th and 12th grade, they had 400 students or something. So it's this minuscule school playing a schedule against other tiny schools in the middle of nowhere, this baseball backwater. And there was really just absolutely nothing there to suggest that Trump was a baseball prospect.
So so you start reporting it, and then did you pitch it to Slate? Did Slate come to you? Like, how does it go from this idea and going through the microfilm to then getting published?
Well, it's sort of bounced around a little bit, but so it went to Slate, and they have really, really good editors over there. So it went through a few more rounds of edits and fact checking, and then we had to go to the White House and be like, hey, the president says he was great at baseball, but everything I found says that he wasn't. What do you want to, how do you want to respond? And at first they sort of sent me a bunch of links to all these stories that I'd already linked to within the story, that said he was good. But all of the Trump biographies, and there's a bunch of them, they all sort of just took at face value this claim that he was a great athlete. Even though, again, there's no evidence of that. So they said, oh, well, why don't you look at this biography and this biography? And I was like, well, yes, but that's the whole thing that I'm trying to debunk. And then eventually some kind of press aide went, or at least says he did, went to the president and said, hey, how about this? And he came back to me and said, the president has nothing to add. And that's when I got this boilerplate quote saying that he was a great athlete. And and that he loves the game of baseball and all the rest. So that was kind of nerve-wracking. But yeah, so it wound up with Slate, and they're really happy to have it. I think it was a good place for it because it's got sort of this reputation of going after established narratives and finding out if they're actually true. So that was a good home for the story.
So as you're reporting this, like the idea that Trump was a good athlete and a good baseball player, I mean, I think I mentioned it to my wife that you had written this piece, and she's like, no, without even looking at it. She doesn't even know baseball. Like it's kind of self-evident, I think, especially to those of us on the political left, that he obviously wasn't. Were you surprised at what you found at all, or did anything kind of, in terms of kind of balancing out what we think you're going to find on this versus what you actually found in your reporting?
So I think there's two pieces to that. To kind of touch on something you said, I really did intend to honestly, I have my own political views, and this is also what I told the former teammates that I spoke to, some of whom are very, very strong Trump supporters, others of whom aren't so much. I said, I just want to find out the truth. It's just this little piece in this very important man, for better or worse, in his past that hasn't really been explored. I mean, he spent 5 or 6 years at NEMA, and it was a really pivotal time in his life, and we know almost nothing about it. But here's something that we can probably find out, right? Because like every other school he went to, his academic and school records were hidden. And so I said, if I find out that he really was a great ball player, that's what I'll write, because that's what the truth will be. So that was one part of it. The other part was, I think that this isn't, so it turns out to be a lie, right? This isn't just another quotidian political lie. This isn't just, lying about hydroxychloroquine or whatever. This is something foundational to the kind of origin story that he tells, to kind of this cult of personality that he built around himself, that he's a success, he's a winner, he always has been, he's always been good at everything, he's special, he can't be beaten, he can't lose, right? So it felt like going back to something like this that you can easily lie about because, well, who's going to check? Oh, well, me, as it turns out. That it was more than just another obfuscation or another lie from behind some podium with a presidential seal on it. So it felt important for that reason to kind of go after this. And a lot of the comments I got after the story ran were, why would you look into this? Don't you have anything better to do? I was like, well, no, actually, I think this is an important thing to look into. I think the stories that people tell about themselves and how they got to be who they are important to fact check when you become someone important down the line.
Right. I was going to ask you about the feedback on it. And actually, what have you gotten? What's the feedback been like compared the Trump story versus the Jordan column that you wrote the other day?
So this is an interesting one. So I wrote this column the other day for Yahoo that's annoyed an awful lot of people.
It's a great column, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So basically, that the thing that The Last Dance, the big Jordan documentary, taught me is that be like Mike was not something that you should actually want to be like. Mm-hmm. He seemed like a now and then sort of a truculent, petty man who has basketball and only basketball, and who's sort of consumed not just by a competitiveness, but something that goes a lot further. He was a bully. He was someone who mistreated his teammates routinely. And the Jordan brand, his own cult of personality is kind of built around this idea that that's what made Jordan Jordan. And that's what made him good. And that's what made the Bulls so good. And I just don't buy that. I think that the Bulls were good in spite of that part of his personality, and in spite of this drive that he had that goes so far past, trying to be great and trying to make everybody else great. And that's just outright abuse. And that, the kind of this Michael Jordan exceptionalism, if you look at it closely, it doesn't really hold up. It seems like his teammates were miserable being on that team with him, and there was very little joy. And I don't actually believe that it made them better, but what do I know? At any rate, I got a lot of feedback on that. There was some Fox Sports radio guy I saw a link to yesterday, had spent a whole 6 minutes whining about it on air, and basically dismissing me on account that I'm actually a soccer writer, even though I do lots of non-soccer stuff, but whatever. But to the Trump story, there was shockingly little pushback from his defenders or from the right. And my theory, and maybe it flatters me a little bit, but I won't let that get in the way, is that it's because I think the story was unassailable. You can quibble with the arguments that I made in the Jordan column because they were arguments, because that was my point of view, and that's how I look at it. And I think Jordan is the embodiment of toxic masculinity, and that, prizing toughness over consideration is kind of what got us into this mess in the first place, and et cetera. But with the Trump piece, I had the receipts. I had these teammates, many of whom were Trump supporters, saying, yeah, he was pretty good. I had all these box scores that suggested he wasn't very good at all. And I just kind of had the facts. And if you wanted to call that fake news, then what that was essentially implying was that a bunch of local papers in the 1960s were conspiring against the future political career of a high school baseball player, right? It was a very hard thing to refute. So I think that's why it didn't get a whole lot of pickup. I mean, there were a few sort of right-wing websites like the Free Beacon that kind of tried to tee off on it. I mean, one of them literally said, why isn't Obama mentioned in this story? Well, it wasn't about Obama. Obama didn't say that he was the best high school baseball player in the States. But so in that sense, it was sort of funny, where I thought that there'd be a lot of pushback and a lot of hate to the Trump story. But it seems like anybody who saw it preferred to just kind of ignore it and not give it oxygen and try to make it go away, because I don't know how much you could really argue against it.
Yeah, the Jordan thing is so interesting. I heard Brandon McCarthy on a podcast this morning say that that Jordan derived, like the attitude he has. It's like, it's not exceptional. Like he's played Major League Baseball for a long time. It's like there's 5 guys on every team who have that kind of attitude and that kind of view and that kind of mindset. It's just Michael Jordan had that, plus was ungodly talented. So it was kind of
right.
It wasn't that made Jordan great. It was the talent that made him great. But I just find that, and I've written about this too on my blog, that it's become a trope in sports writing. He's so competitive. He won't let his kids win at ping pong. You play a game and he slams it. Right. And I'm like, and that's always talked about in this way of praise. And I'm like, if you did that on a game night, you would never be invited back. You're like the horrible person to do that. And it's such a weird trait that sports media has traditionally celebrated. When you look at it with like any kind of like normalized view, it's like, that's a terrible thing to celebrate at the expense of celebrating, work ethic. It's celebrating, all these other things that maybe you could celebrate about them.
Yeah, no, I don't get it. And maybe, I mean, a lot of the negative feedback that I've gotten is, well, you don't understand because you've never won anything and you never played sports, which I did. And we actually did win a high school basketball championship, but whatever. I don't want to poke that bear necessarily. And it also kind of misses the point, because there have been an awful lot of people who've won an awful lot of things who weren't like that. Nobody's ever said of Tim Duncan that he was an abusive teammate, or, there's a lot of examples you could find, probably more examples of transcendent athletes who won lots and lots of things who weren't the way Jordan is than those that were. I just don't buy this whole thing. I truly believe that the Bulls won and were that good in spite of Michael Jordan's treatment of his teammates rather than because of it.
So I ask everybody I have on the podcast this, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing that you've read lately?
You know what? I just finished reading Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer.
Oh, that's a great pick.
I'm kind of catching up on some. I had some a little bit of my Marist budget left last year, and so what I did is I went through the Sports Illustrated all-time top 50 sports books, and I bought everything that I didn't have yet.
Oh, nice.
So I'm just kind of working my way through that. So I just finished that, and that was a book that really knocked me on my rear end.
So I want to, kind of in this vein, the 6 books that you had your students read for that class, the 6 classics, what were they?
Let's see. We started with Friday Night Lights, of course. Then we went to 8 Men Out, which was kind of interesting because big parts of that book were fabricated.
Right.
And so kind of getting into that with the students, like after they finished, like, okay, now let me tell you something. This character and this character and this character didn't actually exist. So that made for fun discussions. Let's see. We read Moneyball. We read Among the Thugs. That's 4. We read Little Girls in Pretty Boxes. And we read, don't blank, Leander, don't blank. Let's see. Friday Night Lights, Moneyball, Among the Thugs, Little Girls in Pretty Boxes, 8 Men Out, and yeah, I'm going to blank on the last one. That's terrible. But we also actually had the authors of 3 of the books Skype into the class, which was really
awesome.
Cool. So we had Buzz Bissinger Skyped in. Bill Buford, who wrote Among the Thugs, Skyped in, and Joan Ryan, who wrote Little Girls in Pretty Boxes. She Skyped in too. So that was great.
Oh, that's awesome. What book, was there a book that the students really responded to that kind of surprised you? Yeah,
none of them had read Friday Night Lights. Most of them had read Moneyball, which is kind of a generational divide. So they liked that. They really loved Friday Night Lights, but they really responded to Little Girls in Pretty Boxes, which that book had been sort of on the bubble for me, but I really wanted to have a book that was about women's sports and B, a book that was written by a woman to kind of diversify a little bit. So they really responded to that because so much of that still rings true now. The themes of Larry Nassar is in that book, I mean, even if it's in the captions to the pictures, but so much of what we later found out about the abusive, nature of gymnastics really resonated with them. So that was gratifying to see.
All right, Leander, this has been great. Enjoy your summer off. I hope it's somewhat more relaxing than this semester has been, and appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.